Hi. So in this video, I'm going to go over passage 2 from the reading comprehension section of test 44. I'm just going to go ahead and read the text aloud first, and my goal is going to be to answer the main point question. So I'm just trying to get a feel for the main point of each paragraph and take in as much as I can on the first read through, but it's completely normal if you go back and read again before addressing the rest of the questions. So this would usually be like a faster read through just to answer that main point or main purpose question that you usually get first. Okay, so in the field of historiography, just historiography. That's how I'm going to pronounce it. The writing of history based on a critical examination of authentic primary information sources. So they just give us a definition there of what historiography is. One area that has recently attracted attention focuses on the responses of explorers and settlers to new landscapes. Okay, so focuses on their responses to new landscapes in order to provide insights into the transformations the landscape itself has undergone as a result of settlement. Okay, so there's this kind of back and forth that they're looking at between explorers and settlers and the landscape. So how does the landscape change as a result of settlement? In this endeavor, historiographers examining the history of the Pacific coast of the United States have traditionally depended on the records left by European American explorers of the 19th century, who, as commissioned agents of the US government, were instructed to report thoroughly their findings in writing. Okay, so traditionally depended on. That's really the key phrase that I'm pulling out of this. So it's quite typical for LSAT reading comprehension passages that we're going to see a move away from tradition. So my expectation is that even though traditionally that's what was depended on, they may be open to other evidence in recent years with the recent attention. So I am often looking in reading comprehension for contrasts and comparisons between groups or between ideas. In this case, looks like maybe it's past and present methodologies in historiography. Oh boy, I'm going to probably stumble over that word for this whole passage. Sorry about that. Okay, next paragraph starts with but. So in contrast to this tradition, most likely. But in furthering this investigation, some historiographers have recently recognized the need to expand their definition of what a source is. So need, again, so here they've depended or needed particular kinds of records, and here they're saying they actually need to expand their definition of what a source is. Source came up here as well. Authentic primary information sources. Maybe there's other sources. They maintain that the sources traditionally accepted as documenting the history of the Pacific coast have too often omitted the response of Asian settlers to this territory. Okay, so this is going to be a key argument, I imagine. And there isn't really any rhyme or reason to the color choices that I'm using for the highlighters. I just switch between them as I'm reading. In part, this is due to the dearth of written records left by Asian settlers. So dearth here might not be a word that you're familiar with. So that would be something that you have to glean from context. So dearth of written records left by Asian settlers. In contrast, okay, so dearth in contrast to the commissioned agents, where have we seen commissioned agents before? Here, and they were instructed to report thoroughly their findings in writing. So that kind of gives us a clue that there aren't as many written records left by Asian settlers. Okay, and so dearth actually means like a lack of written records, right? A scarcity of written records. So they're not going to be as available as the ones by the European American explorers who were commissioned agents. Okay, so in contrast to the commissioned agents, most of the people who first came to Western North America from Asia during the same period did not focus on developing a self-conscious written record of their involvement with the landscape. Okay, so there's not going to be a lot of that written record, so that just confirms that interpretation. But because a full study of a culture's historical relationship to its land cannot confine itself to a narrow record of experience, these historiographers have begun to recognize the value of other kinds of evidence, such as the actions of Asian settlers. So rather than just the written record, they're looking at actions. Okay, and because we can't confine our study to a narrow record of experience, that narrow record being just the written reports of the commissioned agents of the US government. As a case in point, okay, so that's going to be the whole idea of this paragraph, right? Is a case in point. So evidence to support what they've been saying in the second paragraph, which is that we should recognize the value of other kinds of evidence, okay, including like the actions of Asian settlers. The role of Chinese settlers in expanding agriculture throughout the Pacific Coast Territory is integral to the history of the region. Okay, so we need it again to have a complete history of the region. Without access to the better land, Chinese settlers looked for agricultural potential in this generally arid region where other settlers did not. Okay, arid region, right, as opposed to like fertile. So that's interesting. For example, where settlers of European descent looked at willows and saw only useless, untillable swamp. Okay, settlers of European descent saw only useless, untillable swamp. Instead, the Chinese settlers saw fresh water, fertile soil, and the potential for bringing water to more arid regions via irrigation. So bringing water to regions that are more desert-like, that are more dry. Where other settlers who looked at certain weeds, such as wild mustard, generally saw a nuisance, Chinese settlers saw abundant raw material for valuable spices from a plant naturally suited to the local soil and climate. So they saw the potential where the European settlers did not. Given their role in the labor force shaping this territory in the 19th century, the Chinese settlers offered more than just a new view of the land. Okay, so even more than this previous paragraph talks about. Their vision was reinforced by specialized skills. So it wasn't just that they saw the potential, they actually had the skills to make that potential a reality. So specialized skills involving swamp reclamation and irrigation systems, which helped lay the foundation for the well-known and prosperous agribusiness of the region. That 80% of the area's cropland is now irrigated and that the region is currently the top producer of many specialty crops cannot be fully understood by historiographers without attention to the input of Chinese settlers as reconstructed from their interactions with that landscape. So just the, let's see, the irrigation, right? The production, specialty crops, and that is largely due to the input of Chinese settlers. Okay, Great. So let's see if we can answer this main point question. The history of settlement along the Pacific coast of the US, as understood by most historiographers, is confirmed by evidence reconstructed from the actions of Asian settlers. So I wouldn't say we are dealing with most historiographers here. It seemed that there is like a subset that is expanding the definition, some rather than most. And then also where there's a contrast between the traditional understanding and the traditional record versus the expanded definition and the new evidence that some historiographers are bringing in. So I would eliminate that. It also doesn't deal with anything that we come across in the last two paragraphs, really. So like in terms of the details. Okay, B, Asian settlers on the Pacific coast of the US left a record of their experiences that traditional historiographers believe to be irrelevant. So left a record that they, so a record, they definitely didn't leave a written record. This one I'm not loving. It's better than A, but still not quite encapsulating everything. It's not really pulling from every paragraph. And we don't really know what traditional historiographers would think about this new path that some are bringing in. We don't have their response to it. To understand Asian settlers' impact on the history of the Pacific coast of the US, historiographers have had to recognize the value of non-traditional kinds of historiographic evidence. I actually quite like that, right? So it gets specific about the Pacific coast, their impact, non-traditional, right? So there's that contrast to traditional. And yeah, I like that it doesn't say record, right? It's a kind of evidence, but it's not a record, it's their action. So I would eliminate B. Spurred by new findings regarding Asian settlement on the Pacific coast of the US, historiographers have begun to debate the methodological foundations of historiography. So again, I don't really see that debate happening. I see a group that is expanding and going further while they're studying a particular region, but I don't see that there's that the debate is really at the forefront for this passage. I also don't know that it was new findings that motivated this, but rather just like because they want to have a full understanding of the historical relationship to this land, and they don't want to just use like one narrow kind of evidence. So that seems to be more the motivation. By examining only written information, historiography, as it is traditionally practiced, has produced inaccurate historical accounts. Incomplete, not necessarily inaccurate, and that would not be really the main point. It doesn't bring in any of the specifics about the Pacific Coast territory, Chinese settlers, or Asian settlers as a whole. So it's just not quite getting at the main point or summarizing the passage. So I like C the best here. Right, so yeah, it brings in more information from each paragraph. I don't feel like anything is really missing from that statement, at least not in a glaring way. Which one of the following most accurately describes the author's primary purpose in discussing Chinese settlers in the third paragraph? So they're doing it as a case in point. And so it's an example or evidence to support a point that they want to make. And that point seems to be sort of the last sentence of the previous paragraph, right? So a full study of a culture's historical relationship to its land can't confine itself to a narrow record of experience. And because of that, these historiographers have begun to recognize the value of other kinds of evidence, such as the actions of Asian settlers. So the primary purpose, to suggest that Chinese settlers follow typical settlement patterns in this region. No, they're not really trying to say anything even about like the region necessarily. To argue that little written evidence survives. Nope, that wasn't really the point of the third paragraph. They do talk about that in the second paragraph a bit, and they're not really arguing that as a point. That's more the reason why they need to look at other kinds of evidence. To provide examples illustrating the unique view Asian settlers had of the land. I do like that, providing examples, but I don't think that that's really the primary purpose of this discussion, right? It's still like a case in point. So it's still serving for a point that has been made already. D, to demonstrate that the history of settlement in the region has become a point of contention among historiographers. So I do think there's like a contrast and there's sort of this new wave, but I wouldn't focus too much on contention or debate because that isn't the focus through the second, third, and fourth paragraphs. E, to claim that the historical record provided by the actions of Asian settlers is inconsistent with history as derived from traditional sources. Yeah, again, the inconsistent part, I don't see that as really the issue, to say that it's inconsistent. No, I think it's just that we're adding other kinds of evidence to make it a more complete study, rather than saying that this evidence is like shows that the other records are somehow false. So I would eliminate that and I would go with C as the best answer. We do have a for example here as well. So certainly examples make sense, and the unique view, right? They're adding a view that isn't already covered by other groups and other records. So C is the best answer there. 10, the passage states that the primary traditional historiographic sources of information about the history of the Pacific coast of the US have which one of the following characteristics? So primary traditional sources. So I would be looking at the written reports of the commissioned agents. They were written both before and after Asian settlers arrived in the area. That I don't know based off of the passage. They include accounts by Native Americans in the area. Doesn't look like it. They are primarily concerned with potential agricultural uses of the land. That I also don't know for sure. We may have a little bit of evidence of that because they do talk about settlers seeing the swamp as being like useless and untillable, so they don't see its agricultural potential. But that doesn't mean that that's like the only opinion that they put in their reports about the land. D, they focus primarily on the presence of water sources in the region. Can't say that either. They are accounts left by European American explorers. Yes. So traditionally dependent on records left by European American explorers. So when they ask you for something that the passage states, then you're usually going to be able to find much more like direct evidence in the passage. So it's not about like an implication, but a statement in the passage. The author would most likely disagree with which one of the following statements. So here we want to know what the author's opinion is. The author seems to just agree with these historiographers who are moving into new sources of evidence. So yeah, that's the author doesn't really have a lot of sort of subjective commentary, just seems to be reporting these things and supportive of them. Okay, A, examining the actions not only of Asian settlers, but of other cultural groups of the Pacific coast of the US is necessary to a full understanding of the impact of settlement on the landscape there. I think that the author would agree with this, right? That the more cultural groups that of the Pacific coast, the more of their actions and reports and evidence of their interactions with the landscape, the better, right? We want diversity. So I think they would agree, and we're looking for disagree. B, the significance of certain actions to the writing of history may be recognized by one group of historiographers, but not another. I think they would agree with that. Again, certainly don't have any reason to think they would disagree with that. So it's quite a weakly worded statement. It's not very strongly worded, so I don't think that there's necessarily like strong evidence of disagreement. So yeah, it's hard to contradict a statement that is just this might be the case. Recognizing the actions of Asian settlers adds to, but does not complete the writing of the history of the Pacific coast of the US. Yeah, so similar to A, that we can't fully understand it without having that input. But we, if there are other cultural groups, we would need to keep going. So I don't think the author would disagree with this. I think the author would agree. D, by recognizing as evidence the actions of people, historiographers expand the definition of what a source is. Yeah, I do think that that is the expansion that is mentioned. So they need to expand the definition of a source, and originally a source was the traditionally dependent on source, was records. So versus traditionally expended into, so I do think that that's true. So hopefully E is the correct answer, and we have evidence that there's disagreement. The expanded definition of a source will probably not be relevant to studies of regions that have no significant immigration of non-Europeans. Yeah, so that I would say the author would disagree and would think that it actually would potentially be relevant, and maybe even probably be relevant, because you wouldn't just be looking at like specific commissioned agents of the government. You would also be looking at the actions of settlers who never actually wrote down their findings. So yeah, I think you would get into almost like classes within the European American explorers and settlers, and there's still diversity within European groups of explorers and settlers. So even if there's no significant immigration of non-Europeans, you would still have non-written evidence would still be relevant. So I like E. According to the passage, each of the following was an aspect of Chinese settlers' initial interactions with the landscape of the Pacific coast of the US, except. All right. So initial interactions, new ideas for utilizing local plants. Yep. So the weeds, quote unquote, wild mustard. So that's that was something that's in the passage. New view of the land, yep, also in the passage more generally, but certainly there. Specialized agricultural skills for sure, right? The irrigation, I think, and swamp reclamation. Knowledge of agribusiness practices. So where does agribusiness come up? That comes up when they're talking about, what is this? Agribusiness, here we go, yeah. So helped lay the foundation for the now well-known and prosperous agribusiness of the region. So that's like a modern sort of what do you call that? Like, not an offshoot exactly, but that's something that has been like kind of the result eventually of the interactions the Chinese settlers had with the land. So it wasn't like initially their interactions. And knowledge of irrigation systems. Yeah, so their vision was reinforced by specialized skills involving like irrigation systems. So yeah, that was part of their initial interaction, but the agribusiness part, that it's a modern result. Which one of the following can most reasonably be inferred from the passage? So here we're not likely to find super direct quotes or anything. It's an inference. So A, most Chinese settlers came to the Pacific coast of the US because the climate was similar to that with which they were familiar. Unsure about that. B, Chinese agricultural methods in the 19th century included knowledge of swamp reclamation. So I just read about that, right? That, yeah, so their role in the labor force shaping this territory in the 19th century. So we've got the right time period. They offered more than just a new view of the land. They had specialized skills, and that involved swamp reclamation. So yeah, certainly does seem like that can be reasonably inferred. That actually seems quite direct to me. Settlers of European descent used wild mustard seed as a spice. Nope, they just saw it as a weed. D, because of the abundance of written sources available, it is not worthwhile to examine the actions of European settlers, not necessarily. Like I said with a previous question, I think the author would disagree with that and would think that actions are still relevant. What written records were left by Asian settlers were neglected and consequently lost. It doesn't actually seem like they know that there were any written records, or maybe there weren't. They talk about a dearth of written records, and that most of the people who came from Asia didn't focus on developing a written record. So it's less about the written records being neglected and lost, and more that that didn't seem to be like a priority when they were settling, right? They were doing lots of other things on the land, and there probably wasn't a reason to prioritize writing things down, whereas like the commissioned agents were actually instructed to report their findings, right? That was like part of their job that they were paid for, I'm sure. So yeah, that doesn't seem to be supported. So I would go with B. Last one. Which one of the following, if true, would most help to strengthen the author's main claim in the last sentence? So the last sentence, that 80% of the area's cropland is now irrigated, and that the region is currently the top producer of many specialty crops, cannot be fully understood by historiographers without attention to the input of Chinese settlers as reconstructed from their interactions with that landscape. So there is a conditional relationship here, right? It was necessary, and it is necessary to pay attention to the input of Chinese settlers if we're going to understand how this land came to be the way that it is, right? Let's see. Market research of agribusiness owned by descendants of Chinese settlers shows that the market for the region's specialty crops has grown substantially faster than the market for any other crop in the last decade. So the last decade, that's a pretty short time frame. It's not agribusiness owned by descendants of Chinese settlers. I'm not that concerned with like that sort of chain of ownership, or at least I don't think that passage is very concerned with that. So I would keep moving in that answer. 19th century surveying records indicate that the lands now cultivated by specialty crop businesses owned by descendants of Chinese settlers were formerly swamplands. Yeah, maybe, because the formerly swamplands part, we wouldn't really be able to understand how it is now cultivated if we don't understand that the Chinese settlers were involved in swamp reclamation. So that is more connected to the passage, I would say. C, research by university agricultural science departments proves that the formerly arid lands now cultivated by large agribusinesses contain extremely fertile soil when they are sufficiently irrigated. So, sufficiently irrigated. So this is actually saying that irrigation is sufficient, it's not necessarily saying that irrigation is required or necessary. So I don't love that one. D, a technological history tracing the development of irrigation systems in the region reveals that their efficiency has increased steadily since the 19th century. I'm not really concerned about steady increase. I'm more concerned about that initial input. Weather records compiled over the previous century demonstrate that the weather patterns in the region are well suited to growing certain specialty crops as long as they are irrigated. They're irrigated. So that seems really similar to C. Bringing in the weather patterns. Still prefer, I don't know about owned by, because that makes it sort of a subset of all of the specialty crop businesses rather than talking about like all of them. The 80% is now irrigated. Was there irrigated? I'm really not sure here. I prefer the language in E in terms of like how it's necessary to have them irrigated.
Yeah, this is a tough one. So rather than like spending a lot of time on it, I would just choose one of these and move on. Um,
Take. So this one, because we've got like a subset of businesses, I want to eliminate that. I'm going to go with C because of formerly arid lands. So there's that change, even though we do have sufficiency instead of necessity there, I would go with C. But yeah, really not confident. Oh, and it's B. Okay. Yeah. Which yeah, it has the formerly swamplands and descendants of Chinese settlers. Yeah. I suppose maybe that is relevant. So yeah, this would be a question that I would want to review with more input because I really did have a hard time eliminating C and E. So I would want to know what I should have prioritized there for eliminating, and why B is so much better. I would also be interested in commentary about the businesses owned by descendants of Chinese settlers and why that kind of, I think of it almost as like a chain of custody. Like, why would that matter that they were descendants of Chinese settlers? Wouldn't the input of Chinese settlers be relevant even if the land didn't pass down to their descendants? So, yeah, that's yeah, that's um, my attempt at this passage. So 6 out of 7. Um, and I'll definitely look into that one and try to understand where I went wrong there. So hopefully that's helpful. Obviously, it takes me a lot longer to talk through a passage, talk through each of the answer choices than it would take to actually complete the passage. So this is more about accuracy and understanding. And the more practice you do with this and the more confident that you get about accuracy, the more quickly you're going to be able to go eventually. But reading comprehension takes a long time to improve. So just try not to get discouraged and keep going. Yeah. Right. Have a good one. Let me know if you have any more questions.